Morning. It's really good to be together on this Lord's Day morning. And if you're like me, this day is about family. It's about food. It's about kindness and generosity. A lot of times this time of year, there's a lighthearted romance movie somewhere on in the background, whether a Hallmark movie or something with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan or something going on. And I've chosen a story that has all of those elements kind of in it to look at today. I've never preached on the Book of Ruth, but what a powerful, simple, but beautiful story the Book of Ruth is. It is a story about family, finding family in the most unlikely places sometimes, about holding on to each other, about finding a kind of human kindness from each other and a divine kindness and providential care, praying constantly to the Lord and seeing against all hope those prayers find answers. The book starts, if you want to open there, we're going to be there most of the lesson, in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, telling us when it all happens. It comes in the days when the judges rules. This was the dark ages of Israel's history. This is a time when everyone did what was right in his own eyes, as the book of Judges begins and ends telling us. There's no king, so everybody just did what they thought, that seems right to me. No standard, it's all relative, right? Sounds kind of familiar, right? And so this is the kind of world, this is the kind of time, and there's cycles of famine and slavery and difficulty that kept happening in this time period, and then the people would turn to God, and there would be a blessing from God as the judges would lead them. And in this time period, a collection of people, a family, Elimelech and his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, go to Moab, to the country of Moab. Now you got to understand, this is not like, even though they're very close, this is not just like, moving to Ohio or something. This is moving into the land of one of Israel's oldest enemies. You remember back in Numbers, the king Balak tried to get Balaam to curse Israel. Later on, in the time of the Judges, in Judges 3, we read about how King Eglon of Moab enslaved the people, ruled over Israel near this time. And there were periods throughout the time of the Judges where they were enslaved. They were ruled over by the Moabites. And they were not the best of people. They worshiped a god named Chemosh, this false god. And in 2 Kings 3, 26 to 27, you read about the kinds of human sacrifice of their children that they would do. This is the religion of Moab. This is the kind of people that they're in, and they're not viewed well by Israel. Yet from this people come an important figure in Israel's history. Of course, her name is Ruth. She's the only Gentile in that any book is named after in the Old Testament, and one of only two women, of course, with Esther. And let's dive into her story. Her story begins with tragedy. Appreciate, Ralph always does a good job tying in the songs with the lesson. Thinking about that song, "You Are the Rock of My Heart," thinking about when we sing, and "My Faith Looks Up to Thee," about the times of darkness and difficulty we go through. And I think most of us have experienced some kind of tragedy because you don't live long in this world before experiencing the darkness that has come into this world through sin. experiencing the loss of loved ones as they die and leave us feeling so alone and so, as Naomi would say, empty. So after they go into this land, Mahlon and Chilion, they marry, but Elimelech and his 2 sons die, leaving Naomi without her source of security as a woman in that time, her husband, and her source of future security, her sons. You can see a journey in this book that begins with this list of names in chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. And it ends with a list of names. But do you see the difference between these 2 lists of names? It begins with a list of the dead. It begins with an ending of a line. All of those who would carry on the line, this family line that we will find out later is a very important family line, have died. At the end, we read a list, a genealogy that we find ringing down through history, a genealogy woven by God himself. In fact, at the end of that list of names of the dead, Naomi isn't even called Naomi. It just says in verse 5, and the woman. At this point, she's lost her identity. In fact, later on in verse 20, she says, don't even call me Naomi anymore, which means pleasant. That's not who I am anymore. But at the end, we read the people saying, look at Naomi as Naomi's grandson, though they call him her son. They give her to Naomi to nurse. Her son Obed is named in verse 17 of chapter 4, and they name Naomi again, pleasantness. It is a journey from a funeral where it starts to a wedding where it ends, or to put it a different way, from a death to a birth. It begins in famine and it ends in family. This is a book that has a very clear arc. The writer is taking us somewhere to tell us an important story. A story of going from being empty, as Naomi describes herself. I am empty. I came to Moab full, but I'm leaving empty. I got nothing. There is nothing. I mean, it's not just like I don't have wealth. It's not even I don't have family. You get the sense she's saying, I don't have meaning. I don't know what life is anymore. Everything that gave me joy is gone. I'm coming back a broken, haggard, tired woman that's done with all of this. Her faith seems pretty empty too, as we'll see at this point. And with all of this happening at the beginning of the story, Naomi looks to her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and says, you need to go back to your moms. I'm not your mother. Go back to your home. Be with your family. You have nothing. I have nothing to offer you. I have no more sons. And so Orpah does. But Ruth will not go. Ruth clings to her. You know, it's an interesting thing when you think about family. I think most people, when they think about family, I have a great mother-in-law. And some of you are here with your mother-in-laws, but a lot of us don't think of mother-in-laws as that core family person, that key connection. But for Ruth, she said, I will not let you go. You are my family. I choose you, even though you have nothing to offer me. You're not going to provide for me like a husband. In fact, you're going to take me to a place I've never been. I know no one. I will be a foreigner. I may be quite unwelcome. And we're going to be two widows with nothing to offer. But she says, first, this is Naomi's words. Naomi says to these women, this is the first, by the way, of a series of blessings. Throughout this book, this whole book is going to be driven, as the book of Genesis and many other books of the Bible are, by prayers for blessing. See, what we're going to see is people are going to call out to the Lord to do things. And then it's not going to say, and the Lord did it. But we're going to see, look how that worked out. And we're going to see these prayers answered over and over again. Because when we call on the name of the Lord, there is power in it. And a blessing is a prayer, we see this often in Scripture, that's spoken to the person, but invoking the name of the Lord. See, it's not saying, Lord, please deal kindly with them, but it's essentially the same when she says, may the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you might find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. This word, kindly, is going to be, as we'll see, an important word, or kindness it'll be used as several times in the book. It's the word chesed, the Hebrew word, one of those guttural, weird-sounding ones we don't say very often. And it speaks of God's steadfast love. In fact, that's often how it's translated. The steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. It's spoken of when God describes himself in Exodus 34, the Lord, who has this covenant love or kindness, this unfailing steadiness and loyalty that will endure from generation to generation. And Naomi prays, may the Lord rain his kindness on you, and may you have rest. May you have security. Rest in the Old Testament and throughout Scripture is not about taking a nap. It's not about getting a day off. Rest is about the security and blessing we find under the ordered rule of God. The security and blessing when we are under the ordered rule of God. So whenever the people of Israel came into the land of Canaan to find rest, it didn't mean they weren't going to work anymore. They were going to have a different kind of security and blessing. No more wondering, no more, what is my land? People attacking me from all sides. They'll have a place. They'll have God providing for them under his ordered care. And she prays that she'll not only find rest, but find it in the house of your husband. I wonder if that prayer will be answered. But that statement of Ruth that I mentioned earlier, this statement of devotion, many people, including my wife and I, use some form of this phrase in our wedding vows when we talk about reading these words, because it's such a beautiful statement, though this has nothing to do with marriage here, of commitment and devotion and love and loyalty. She says, do not urge me. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. She says, from where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people are going to be my people, and your God, my God. I'm right next to you. I'm holding on to you. If you're going to Israel, that's where I'm going, wherever you're going. But listen, there's more to this than devotion to Naomi. There is much more going on here. She saw something in Naomi, maybe in her husband. She learned something about the difference between Shamash, this awful God, and the true God of Israel. This is a conversion. As your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And then she calls on the name of God. She says, where you die, I will die there. I will be buried. May the Lord, notice this all caps there, because she's calling on Yahweh. May Yahweh, she knows his name, do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And that moment, that decision, changed history. One young widow's commitment of loyalty and kindness. And so they left Moab and they went back to Bethlehem. And there in Bethlehem, the people said, is this Naomi? Boy, it's been a hard period. It's been a hard time. Is this Naomi? And Naomi, as I said, says to them, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Don't call me pleasantness. Call me bitterness. Now, I said her faith is starting to run on empty, it seems. Now, she does know that the Lord is there. She ascribes sovereignty to him. But she doesn't seem to have a sense of his care, his goodness, his favor. Instead, this sounds kind of like Job at his worst moments, huh? As the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me? And the Almighty, Shaddai, has brought calamity upon me. And so we get this glimmer of hope in Ruth's loyalty and commitment. And then we turn back with Naomi, it seems, as a main character, and we get this dark cloud. This is where Naomi rests right now. And she's not alone. Surely, many of us have found ourselves asking difficult questions of the Lord, struggling to see his goodness. But things are dark for a period for Naomi, but there is a journey. There is a destination that the Lord is leading her to. And boy, is there a destination the Lord is leading us to through the darkness, through the difficulty. And so chapters 2 and 3 focus on this idea of the wings of refuge. This is a phrase we'll find in chapter 2, referring to God, and in chapter 3, referring to a person through whom God can answer the prayer for wings of refuge. And the picture is of like a hen or a mother bird putting its wing over its chicks and protecting those babies. It plays out like this, and I know it seems like a simple story, but this is a intricately detailed story, carefully crafted book. It goes from this parallel in chapter 1 and chapter 4 and these opposites that we see continually playing out. And then chapter 2 and 3 reflect each other. And so they're going to have the same kind of 3 scenes playing out. First, it starts with a plan. In the morning, Naomi and Ruth are going to be with each other. Chapter 2. Again, in chapter 3, it starts with a plan. Naomi and Ruth figuring out, what are we going to do? Naomi giving counsel to Ruth. And then, in the middle, scene 2 is going to be a meeting between Boaz and Ruth in Boaz's field. Right there in the middle of chapter 2, right there in the middle of chapter 3. And then both chapters are going to end with Ruth recounting what happened and them rejoicing together about what had happened that day. So we're going to see that progress in chapter 2 and that progress in chapter 3. So chapter 2 starts with a plan. Ruth says, hey, we need some food. Let me go out to a field and get us some food. And of course, God's law made provision for the poor to, along the edges, find unharvested grain. Very providentially, they return to the city of bread. They return to this place, this city, at the time of the barley harvest, a time when there will be plenty, where there will be a lot. They left in famine, they return, and there's plenty. And God is going to provide through his law, through generous people who follow his law, and through his blessing. Let me go and glean food. And she says, go. And then I love the way it says this. And she happened to come to the field belonging to Boaz. Like, in case we were going to miss the coincidence, the inspired writer tells us, what have we here? And that's how it's phrased. It's a lot like the Book of Esther, right? Remember how the Book of Esther never mentions the name of God? Now, this mentions God's name, but it doesn't ascribe to him all the things that are happening. Like Esther, you just see these things happening, and you're meant to put together, this was not coincidence. The believer does not see luck happening. The believer sees the hand of God. He happens to come to the field of Boaz. And so there they meet. And Boaz tells her to keep close to his young women. He's this woman going out, and he says, my young men are not going to touch you. When you're thirsty, you have a drink from what my young men are drinking. You take care of yourself. You're going to be safe in my field. You start to see who this man is. He's introduced in chapter 2, verse 1, as a worthy man. This is a man of character. And Ruth says, why have I, a foreigner, found favor with you? And Boaz responds, I've heard all you've done for your mother-in-law. See, I see character in you. I know who you are. The Lord repay you a full reward from the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Do you see, this is another prayer for blessing, and it's going to be answered. Here's a funny thing that happens sometimes. I want you to notice when it happens, so I'm going to tell you about it now. What if you are going to be the answer to your own prayer? What if God is going to hear your prayer and design the circumstance such that you are going to have the opportunity to take righteous action and answer the very prayer that you're asking? Lord, I pray that, my best friend would hear the gospel and would come to you. And then your friend asks you a question, and it's like, okay, you prayed for it. Now you tell them the gospel, and they will come to me, or they won't. But you have this opportunity. That's going to happen for Boaz and his prayer. May the Lord put his wing of mercy and refuge over you. He sees her character, and he prays for security for her, just like Naomi has prayed. He says, I've found favor in your eyes. You've comforted me. You've spoken kindly. There is a connection forming here. Yes, this is not a meet cute like you find in one of those romantic comedies, but there is something happening here, and the biblical writers want us to see this. There is a tenderness between these two who have no reason to have this connection that you would think. This wealthy farmer and this widow who has nothing. It says she ate until she was satisfied. And she had some left over. I ate until I was full. Some of us are going to do that and then regret it later this afternoon. But she maybe hadn't been full in a long time. She left empty, and now she's full and she has some left over. And she brings it to Naomi, and the same thing is said there. Naomi has all of this left over, so much that she is full. She says, today I worked with a man named Boaz, as she comes home and recounts all of this. And Naomi says, may he be blessed by the Lord. And he's going to be. Whose kindness hasn't forsaken living or dead. He's a redeemer. What is she starting to see? Oh, maybe I'm not so bitter after all. May he be blessed. Barak, may he have God's rich, abundant blessing. This isn't about Boaz's kindness, though he's showing generosity, but it's about God's kindness. God's kindness hasn't forsaken the dead, who it seemed like they were left without any right for their name to continue, and the living are not forsaken. That's me and Ruth. God has not given up on us. And she says, he's a redeemer. What? Jesus is our redeemer. What's that about? What is a redeemer? Pretty important idea here. We first find this idea talked about with God freeing the Israelites from slavery. And often in the New Testament, it has this idea of buying our freedom, right? In Israel, it had two functions. There was someone called the Goel, the Redeemer. There were two different functions. One was, this is kind of dark here, if someone is killed, and say there's manslaughter that this person has committed, that person has to run to a city of refuge quickly before the close relative who is appointed as the redeemer or the kinsman redeemer goes and finds them and kills them, avenging the death that they've brought. So part of being a redeemer is a kind of vengeance. It's a justice that is brought. And guess what? When God redeemed Israel from Egypt, he did just that. In the Red Sea, as the armies of Pharaoh, in the plagues. God redeemed, God conquered, brought justice. But then there's this other side, where the Redeemer, the close relative, whenever someone died, a man died who had the rights of the land, in order to preserve the line and keep that right of the land going to that same family that God appointed from the beginning as the allotments were, then the close relative who's appointed as the Redeemer would marry the widow of that man, and their son would be considered not his son, but also this other man's son. He's continuing the line of this other man. And so we see this, and the inheritance, of course, goes to then that son that would have belonged to that man. And so we see Naomi's line and Elimelech's line continuing through a redeemer. And of course, we have a redeemer who would not only buy us from slavery, but who would take and preserve us, bring us in as a destitute widow, who would marry us as a bridegroom, who would care for us and give us an inheritance. And so we get to chapter 3, and again, it starts with a plan. Ruth is told by Naomi, I seek rest for you, again, security, that you may be well. That you may be well. Wash and anoint yourself. Get pretty, dress up nice, and do everything you need to do to go and be as presentable as you can. And then I want you to go and don't let him see you at first. Go and uncover his feet when he's lying down, and he'll tell you what to do. Boy, I'll tell you, first of all, Naomi must have had quite a bit of confidence in Boaz to send a vulnerable woman at night into that field to lie down at his feet. And this seems pretty risque in our time, much less in that time. And you're supposed to see that. But everyone here is going to handle themselves carefully and righteously. Imagine this older man, Boaz, laying there. It says at midnight, the man was startled and he turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he says, "Who are you?" And she tells him, "I'm Ruth." And then she makes, you might not pick this up. This is a little backwards. Not Boaz saying this. And nobody's down on a knee with the ring. But this is a marriage proposal of sorts. It says, "Spread your wings over your servant, for you're a redeemer." Do you see how, you remember what we said about those wings? Boaz prayed for God's wings of refuge to come over her. And now she's saying, she doesn't say, "Put your money where your mouth is," but she's saying, "Hey, would you be the one through whom God provides this? Because God has in his law made provision for me, and you're the one who can do this. You are a redeemer." And Boaz says, another blessing, "May you be blessed by the Lord. You've made this last kindness greater than the first. You've not gone after young men." Again, a blessing, and this chesed from God that has been spoken twice in blessings before is spoken again in a blessing, but this time it's not about God's kindness, God's chesed. This time it's about Ruth's kindness. And Boaz sees her willingness to ask for this marriage as a kindness. He says, "Don't fear. I'll do all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know you're a worthy woman." Now, he was described as a worthy man back in chapter 2, verse 1. Now, she's described as a worthy woman, and then in chapter 4, verse 11, they're going to say, "May you act worthily." Now, this is the exact same phrase that's famously used in Proverbs 31. Sometimes we translate it the virtuous woman, the valiant woman, the woman of valor, the worthy woman. This is the other place that word is used to describe this woman, Ruth. You are a worthy woman. And when a worthy woman and a worthy man find each other, that is how a righteous and right marriage begins. None of us are perfect. But when people of character marry, then there is the opportunity for oneness and blessing. This is a very different kind of courtship that we see happening than we often see. But maybe we can learn something from this. As they are so deeply committed to following God's law throughout, as they're careful, as there's prayer woven throughout it, and as they both are looking for character in each other. So then finally there's the recounting and joy. "Hey, how'd it go out there in the fields?" He said, "You must not go back empty." Call back to chapter 1. "And he gave me 6 ephahs, all this grain." And so chapter 4, we find the redemption happen. And we won't go into it for time, but Boaz is very clever in the way he plays this out. The next scene plays out in the city gates where Boaz has a plan, and there's another kinsman redeemer who is closer. And so Boaz wants to make sure he's following God's law appropriately. And so he says, hey, if you want to buy this land, it's available for you. And the kinsman redeemer says, yeah, I want to buy it. And he says, oh, yeah, whenever you do, there is a widow that you're going to marry. And he said, oh, you go ahead. That's cool. You got it. And so Boaz, by constructing that whole thing, says, okay, and he takes his sandal and they make an agreement. He says, okay, I am going to marry Ruth. And all the people say, may she be blessed. May she be like Rachel and Leah, and may you bear sons, and may you be richly blessed together. And of course, that's just what happened. So Jeff Jones and I sometimes talk about, when we talk, every once in a while we'll have this conversation about Bible classes and the so what. If you don't have a so what in your lesson, you're missing something. So what does this have to do with you and me? Is this a great story, or is this a story with eternal consequence? Here's the so what. There was a lot happening in the world at this time. This is the end of the Bronze Age, about to begin the Iron Age. Over in China at this time, there's the Shang Dynasty, and there's great developments in math and art and astrology and military. And over in ancient Greece, this is the setting, the time when the setting of the Iliad and the Odyssey took place. And amazing things are happening all over the world, and yet, I tell you, this is the most important thing that was happening in the world. This widow coming back. This widow clinging to her mother-in-law. This widow converting to follow the true God. This widow named Ruth marrying Boaz and bearing a son. Well, why is that so important? Well, an astute Bible student will start to see the clue in chapter 1, verse 1, when you read that these are people of Bethlehem. You know, Bethlehem was not an important town. It was not a big city. It's right there in the song, "Oh, little town of Bethlehem," right? But this town is mentioned 7 times in this book. Bethlehem. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. It's funny, they leave in a famine that's happening in the house of bread. But they come back in the barley harvest and find abundance from God. Bethlehem is famous because of really 2 people that were born there. The people say, may you be renowned in Bethlehem. And boy, she was. In Luke 2:11 we read, for unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Why is Bethlehem the city of David? Because David was born there. This is where his folks come from. Why was he born there? Remember, we said this is a list of names to a list of names. And boy, that second list is important. We go from the time of the judges to a king. And this book ends with the name of the first great king. The man after God's heart. In this genealogy, we read the line from Perez, the son of Judah, to David. Matthew 1 repeats that same lineage, and then it continues it on from David to Solomon, all the way down to Joseph and to Jesus. Why are genealogies important? What's the big deal about a genealogy in the Bible? You know, as we see like nativity scenes and everything around, and we talk about Jesus' birth, I've been trying to emphasize with the kids that the most important thing about these stories, Though there's many amazing things. Isn't, the gifts of the wise men or the cuteness of the baby or the strangeness of a baby in a feeding trough or, no room at the inn. The most amazing and wonderful thing about this story, we could summarize in a word: incarnation. The most amazing thing is these people were physical relatives through which God became flesh. So that everything that you experience, I can experience. He came from a line. He came from a promise that God made to Abraham, and God told the story and wove the story and cared for his people down through history. And it's interesting, these two lineages in chapter 4 of Ruth and Matthew 1 are the same, except for Matthew notes two women. Women in the genealogy of Jesus. In a Jewish genealogy. You don't do that in a Jewish genealogy. Rahab and Ruth. See, Boaz's mom was a Gentile too. Boaz's mom was a harlot from the awful city of Jericho who had faith and became converted to Israel. And then Ruth was a Gentile who had faith and was converted to the God of Israel. Why are Rahab and Ruth named in this Jewish genealogy? Because this is the beginning of God's promise. This is not a promise just for the lost sheep of Israel. Jesus said, I have other sheep too. In John chapter 10, in that great passage about the good shepherd, he said, I have other sheep that aren't of this flock. He was talking about us. He is the king of the whole world because we have a journey too that goes from death to birth. We were dead in our sins and our trespasses, and we were heading for eternal death whenever we were born again by the water and the Spirit. We have a journey from emptiness to fullness. Let me read you these two passages, and the lesson is yours. And we'll invite you, if you don't know Jesus, to come to him in faith, confessing your faith, repenting, being baptized in his name for the remission of sins. We were empty. Paul says, for you know, in chapter 8, verse 9 of 2 Corinthians, you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in the next chapter, chapter 9, verse 8, he says, and God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. You came here today. Perhaps you were struggling with something. Perhaps you were separated from the Lord and empty. May you